Well, if we can be truly aspirational, and I say the following, not merely as someone who believes in the free market, but far more importantly, in the effect that the tax code has on undermining self-governance, we need to completely overhaul our taxation system in this country for this reason. I mean, I care about the corporate tax rate, but I almost don't care. What I really care about in the tax code is the existing disincentives to family formation. There are disincentives in the tax code to lower income people being married, which we believe, according to our research at Heritage, has an effect on the birth rate. These are existential problems for America as a society. So if I had a magic wand, I would simplify the tax code. The second thing that I would do is I would get Congress to completely overhaul, at the very least, the Department of Education. And, you know, if I had my druthers, if Heritage had its druthers going all the way back to the day the Department of Education was founded, we would eliminate it entirely. Not for the purposes of harming public education, but quite the opposite. For the purposes of helping kids and helping teachers who want to take initiative.
Kevin Roberts, welcome.
You know, Dr. Arnn, it's a pleasure to be here. I don't know if I'm going to be a hoot, though.
A hoot? That's what you are.
That's a high standard.
You're a Louisiana boy, but now Texas you're fond of because you live there.
Yes.
And I regard you as a city boy. And Arkansas, we look literally and geographically down on Louisiana.
Well, everything in relation to Arkansas is more sophisticated and urbanized.
That's it. We're rustics in Arkansas. Well, Mississippi. Sometimes
you have a point.
Sometimes we rank ahead of Mississippi. And Louisiana's putting on airs now. Your town is 200,000 people.
That's right. It's a formerly great oil and gas town. But sort of to swerve into policy real quick here, the globalization of that business has had an impact on the rural communities outside my hometown, which is why it's grown. So a lot of country people live in my city.
Yeah. Well, they better. I hope they remain so.
I hope so.
We're taping this not long before the election, and I hope that country people continue to vote like country people.
We need country people to turn out like they've never turned out before.
That's really important. Okay, we're going to talk a lot about the Heritage Foundation today, but first we're going to start with you, because you're an interesting guy. Your mother's maiden name is Rabelais. Is that Louisiana French?
Yes, that's her married name. My stepfather's name. Her maiden name is Petrie, P-I-T-R-E. Both are French, and both are Cajun French. So my maternal ancestors arrived in Louisiana, and I write about this in an upcoming book in 1785 from Nova Scotia. They were exiles from France because of turmoil there. They go to this French colony that eventually the British take over, and the British show up one day to these Roman Catholics and say, you can speak French, but you can't go to Mass. And I'm very proud of what is a pretty legitimate legend in my family, which is my many times great-grandfather said, heck no.
Yeah.
And he cut off his nose to spite his face. And with 10,000 other people, sailed the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico and ended up in New Orleans and eventually went inland. And my mom is a direct descendant of them, which means that I am. And my grandfather, Mark Petrie, was someone who spoke Cajun French as his native tongue. Not formally educated well, but someone who was educated in the ways of the world and is my hero.
Oh, wow.
He helped raise me.
And when was this, when they made this trek over to America?
There was one wave in the early 1780s and then another second big wave in 1785. And almost all of them arrived in New Orleans, which of course was an internationally important port city. And a lot of the real estate and jobs there were already taken. And so these folks either went straight up the Mississippi River, past Baton Rouge, north of Baton Rouge to what is today St. Francisville, Point Coupee Parish. My ancestors went up the Atchafalaya and the Bayou Teche from St. Martinville and ended up in one of the great Cajun places in the world, Opelousas, Louisiana, population 18,000. So maybe that's a little more comfortable for your Arkansas
self. Still a little big for us, but 18,000 is in the range. Why'd you go to Texas?
Because it's the greatest school on the planet, other than Hillsdale.
Yeah. Do you really think that?
It's my favorite professional football team.
Yeah. Yeah. That's it.
I went there because, all kidding aside, well, we like Texas, although my wife is from a place near Lafayette too. We're adopted Texans, but we've lived there a couple times, and we consider the Texas Hill Country one of our favorite places. But as a scholar, Texas had the best assortment of early American historians who focused on the slave trade, which was my interest. And so professionally, it was a good place to be, even though I was, as I am now, a conservative Christian. I was treated well. I was professionally formed well, had a really, really excellent training there as a historian, as a social historian.
Why the slave trade? How'd you get interested in that?
You know, when I was doing my master's, Larry, at Virginia Tech, where I also had really good formation and training, I got interested in the African-American family. Historically, because in a class on family history, I read Daniel Patrick Moynihan's report on the Black family from the 60s. And the gentleman who became my thesis advisor was a scholar of social history and family history. And he said, Roberts, you might just want to pursue your interest in the Black family. And I just kept going farther back in time, eventually found some plantation records in which the plantation owner in central Virginia kept very detailed records, genealogical records of generation after generation after generation of slaves. This is highly unusual, as you know. And that, the short version is, led me to real appreciation for some of the macro level changes that were happening, in particular, to sum up here, the transition from the transatlantic slave trade coming to an end, legally at least, in the United States in 1808, as you know, and the domestic slave trade, where slaves were being sold by the scores from the upper South to the lower South. My dissertation focused on that.
How'd you meet your wife?
Oh, it's a great Southern story. She always wants me to sort of dress this up, but I think it's great. It's very typical of our hometown, which is the heart of Cajun country. I was still finishing college. She was out gainfully employed. And during Christmas week, one year, she was out with a group of friends. I was out with a group of friends at a place called Grant Street Dance Hall, one of the most famous honky-tonks in our hometown. And I bought her a beer. I had no pickup line. It wasn't a pickup kind of place. And we danced a little bit. And I said, I'd like to take you out on a date next week. She said, I don't know you, but here's my phone number. And about a year or so later, we were married. And so 27 years later, 4 kids later, we wish Grant Street Dance Hall were still around so we could go back and have another cold beer.
Yeah. I had my honeymoon in the Pyrenees. I married an English girl. And next year, I intend for us to go back to the hotel where we stayed in the Pyrenees for our honeymoon.
Oh, that'll be great.
And that hotel is still there. And in fact, we've been there once. And the little toddler boy is now manager of the place, but his mom is still alive.
Oh, what a wonderful story.
It's great.
I hope you're able to make the trip.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah. My girl will still go with me, she says.
That's good. Don't do anything to change that.
I wouldn't do that. Okay. You ran a school and you ran a college and you've been a college professor. Tell us about that a little bit. All of those. Sure.
Well, when I finished at Texas, I joined the faculty of a public university in the Southwest and taught a little bit of everything. It was a good job in that it combined the research interests, which you know well, along with the teaching interest, which was also my passion. And it was a good place to be. But along the way, a very important part of our story is that Michelle, my wife, and I, as cradle Catholics, never really took our faith very seriously until the day Pope John Paul II died. And that for us caused what we call in our faith a reversion, and we started taking our faith a lot more seriously. And that led me to discern that I wasn't really called to remain a professor, but to get into K through 12 education, where I thought that perhaps more faithful Catholic schools should exist, and that led to the creation of John Paul the Great Academy in Lafayette, Louisiana. Close to its 20th year, it's flourishing in spite of its founder. And after that, although I thought we would be there for a while, Wyoming Catholic College came knocking because they were looking for a second president. They were the newest Catholic college in the country. They were looking for someone who might be able to recruit among high school students, had a little bit of connection to the homeschool world, and also who had something of a track record in fundraising. And so the Holy Spirit intervened. We went to Wyoming, and it was great to be out there. I should say, as I say in all of my stories about our time at Wyoming Catholic College, that when we got the status for accreditation that made us eligible for federal student loans and grants, I remember vividly sitting in a board meeting and saying to our board, I hope you don't fire me, but I think we need to go the way of Hillsdale College and reject student loans and grants. And I'd tell you, Larry, were it not for the example set by Hillsdale and, dare I say, you and all your faculty and board and supporters, Wyoming Catholic College to this day would not be able to say that, like Hillsdale, it doesn't take those loans and grants.
That's a good outfit. I admire them. And I was on the search committee that brought you to the Heritage Foundation.
Oh, against your better judgment.
Yeah, and I thought, okay, wonder why he left that thing. But you did leave it to go to a public policy thing.
Yeah, and that's a twofold explanation. The first is, as I told people up to that point, I've got two great passions in life, politics and education, and I make a living in education. And then because at Wyoming Catholic College, we were confronted by the Obama administration in two ways. One on the aforementioned issue of loans and grants, but the second was on the contraceptive mandate of Obamacare, which is a faithful Catholic college we simply could not participate in. People can have a different thought about that, which is fine. It's America. But for us, we simply couldn't. And what that did was kind of wet my whistle for policy and politics. And this opportunity came up to join the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Ironically, there were some opportunities to do public policy in D.C., but I turned to my wife and I said, well, I never want to live in D.C., so let's just go back to Austin.
Isn't that good? I took up advertising with the great Rush Limbaugh, whom I was privileged to know for 35 years. And he wanted us to do that. And he appealed to me several times to do it, and I wouldn't do it. But you've been moved by the same thing I was moved at. Oh, President Obama said out loud once, you've got to stop listening to Rush Limbaugh. And here was I thinking the president had the job of protecting our right to do that. And it made me mad. And I said, we're going to advertise in Rush Limbaugh. And one of my staff guys said, President made you mad. That's how you got into the think tank business.
That's exactly right.
Same guy.
Same guy. You know, as my wife reminds me, maybe your wife reminds you this too, men are simple creatures.
Yeah, aren't they though? Yeah. It's, you try to figure out really big things and ponder them like crazy, and then something ticks you off. And there you go.
And then you're down that path for more years than you can count, right?
That's it. Okay, the Heritage Foundation. I'm a trustee of the Heritage Foundation. I will disclose to the crowd here, and I've been a trustee for 742 years now, and it's a pleasure to me. And we have a great president there now. So now we're gonna talk about that. I've got two main questions I want us to discuss. One is, what's going on in the country? And the other is, how do we stop it? And we're going to try to describe the long road we would travel to get away from all this. But first, let's describe this. What is going on in America today?
I think you have two main channels or streams of problem. One is a hyper concentration of power in what I call the imperial city, Washington. This has been going on for decades, and sort of philosophically, foundationally beginning under Wilsonian progressivism, accelerating in the 30s under FDR, the 60s under LBJ. But it's a problem that both Democrats and Republicans have contributed to for a lot of reasons, not just Democrat and Republican presidents, but perhaps equally importantly, Democrat and Republican members of the House and Senate who give away not just the authority that they have in the Constitution, but the duty they have in the Constitution to make sure that their branch of government is as energetic as the executive and judicial branches. And what that has done is create this huge administrative state in which we have roughly 2.5 million people working in it. Nothing against them as human persons, obviously, but those unelected bureaucrats, to put it sort of plainly, basically set law for us. And that is a huge problem as it relates to Americans being able to enjoy self-governance. But the second channel, or the second stream, which I think is at least equally important to that and often not covered enough in sort of legacy media outlets, is a social and cultural deterioration in which it's sort of come back to this point, Larry, about self-governance, it seems as if too many Americans don't really even want to be self-governing, not just in their seemingly automatic dependence on government, but even in how they behave. And by that, it's not a moral judgment, but it is an observation as something of a social scientist that this is new in the United States. And it might have something to do with the decline in religiosity. It might have a lot to do with the decline in the birth rate, the deterioration of the American nuclear family. In short, to sum up here, because there's a lot there to discuss, I think the way a lot of us who are analysts of this kind of thing put it is that America's institutional life, not just big institutions like, say, Ivy League universities, but the most important institution, the family, have deteriorated to the point that we simply can't transmit the eternal things, the permanent values that humans have imprinted on their soul from one generation to the next. The collision or the combination of those two things has created an America that I think, if we don't reverse this, is in its last chapters.
So that's a political thing, and call it a cultural thing. Wonder how they're related. Do you think?
Yeah, it's a bit of a chicken or egg question, right? Was it if we accept both of these claims, which I think you and I do to some extent or another, is it the social and cultural deterioration that spawned this political problem? Politics is not always downstream from culture. Sometimes politics, of course, can affect culture, and I think that they might be right. And by that, you think about what the administrative state does, you think about what Congress does, you think about the example that you mentioned recently just now of President Obama. It used to be that the President of the United States, even if he disagreed with how you were exercising your right, would want to defend your right and promote your ability to do it, right? That has changed in modern America, and it is difficult to tease out which of those problems, the social or the political, came first.
So, I have an opinion about that. I'll offer.
I bet you do.
In book 7 of Aristotle's Politics, there's a wonderful paragraph that says, you can't have a good political system without a good education system, and vice versa. And that means that it may not be that one is upstream from the other. It could be that they're in a pool together, and they affect each other. The law is the decisive thing, right? The thing that can command a monopoly on force is a law in any country, ours included. If you run away from a cop to escape a parking ticket, the whole U.S. Army can come after you if they have to. And so, yeah, that's right. If you change the fundamental institutions, the institution of politics are a fundamental institution, and the family is a fundamental institution, and the family is regulated today in powerful ways. You were interested in the black family. The greatest person I know is Clarence Thomas, and I admire him very much. And one of his favorite things to say is that the loss of the black family is a tragedy only surpassed by slavery. And the loss of the black family was 100 and some years later.
It was. And too few Americans know that.
Yeah.
And just there are a lot of things to say about that, but I will say, because we've mentioned him a couple of times, and I really mean this more in sort of a historical, social sense than a political one. I think the greatest tragedy of Barack Obama's presidency was that he, as an African-American man of great achievement, did not take that on. And he hasn't taken it on in retirement. And I'm optimistic enough, as you know, or hopeful enough, as you know, that he's young enough that perhaps he will come to that realization. I hope and pray for that. But that's precisely the kind of thing, and he's precisely the person who should take that up. And the fact that that doesn't happen actually is an example of the social and cultural and political disease that exists in this pool.
Yeah. If you study the doctrines of the early progressives, they were hopeful, and their political rhetoric is, we're not going to change big things, just this sensible thing and the next sensible and the next, right? But in the end, what they wanted to do was subject the society to the claims of science. And science doesn't mean knowing anymore. It means organized trial and effort by people who call themselves scientists. And they're going to govern everything. And you can see then why, if that becomes the dominant idea, people would get less interested in self-government. They would be interested in hearing what the scientists say through the government. So yeah, and if you look at the quantities are staggering. We have, I think our gross domestic product runs something south of 20 trillion, and we're 35 trillion in debt. And my favorite fearsome statistic is in 1930, the government was 12% of the gross domestic product. Now it's 51%. In 1930, over 60% of the money raised and spent of that 12% was raised and spent in cities and counties and towns. Now that number is about 18%. The federal government used to be 23%. Now it's 63%. So the money has moved away from the people into government and then to the most remote part of government. And that is a restructuring of the economy of the nation. And that is staggering to me when I think about that.
It is. And to your earlier point, that can't do anything but affect negatively Americans' practice of self-governance. And I love your example, even though it's one of tragedy, about how much we're told we must trust the science. We were told that recently, you in your capacity as president of this great institution during the COVID years, I leading the Texas Public Policy Foundation, advising Governor Abbott, a great man and a great governor. But even someone like Governor Abbott and many conservatively minded individuals were vulnerable intellectually to this trope of trust the science. And this is the same trope that told us in the 1880s and 90s in the highest of the ivory towers, that social Darwinism was science, that somehow there was this gradation of races and ethnicities, some of them superior to others. And it's also the same trope that tells us that humans have had such an effect on climate that we have to impose tens of trillions of dollars of solutions that if we implement them all with a magic wand at this moment, Larry, we change the global temperature by 0.5 degree Celsius. Now, there's a conversation to be had there. As we say at Heritage, let's talk about the trade-offs. Let's have an intellectually honest conversation. But you see, trusting the science isn't about having an intellectually honest conversation involving the scientific method.
Yeah.
It's about doing not just what elites tell us to do, but increasingly elites who control the purse strings of government grants on science. This is but one example of the kinds of things we have to fix.
The imperial city, you describe it. We work with these three genius doctors, Bhattacharya, Atlas, and Kulldorff. And one of the points they make is that most of the research money in the natural sciences and in the health sciences, the subdivision of the natural sciences, comes from two institutions in Washington, D.C. And that means if you want to do a big study and fund your lab to show that global warming is perhaps not a thing or not a bad thing or not even a thing, you're not going to get any dough. And the peer-reviewed journals are heavily under similar influences. And that means that science is in a conflict of interest now. And the government is because if the government, the constitutional system in America is simple. It's very beautiful, but also not that complicated. Sovereignty is in the people. They elect people to govern. They don't do it themselves. They got to wait for elections. Don't get to act today. But if the government gets to be half the economy, who's choosing whom now? And there's where we are. And I'll summarize this. You're saying the economic and political relationships in the country have been transformed in massive ways. And we're saying that began with a bad doctrine. The doctrine was that science can decide everything, whereas the truth is it can't. For example, is the truth a good thing? I had a recalcitrant professor years ago, in a conflict that's long since over. He said, I believe that the only way to demonstrate a thing objectively is through the scientific method. And I said, did you arrive at that proposition through the scientific method?
And he said?
He said, oh. I love that.
But I'll say, and briefly, because I know we have other things we want to cover, it's important that people understand the problem of the statement, trust the science, just inherently, but also a discrete point from that some people have taken that idea and they have applied it to the quote unquote science of government, to the point that one of the great aims of the progressives, which was the implementation of technocracy, has happened. Mm-hmm. We live under that. And in fact, it's even worse in some other parts of the world, like the European Union. And every American should have a problem with that. But I would think particularly those who would find themselves somewhere on the center right of the ideological spectrum, when they hear technocracy, should see almost or hear almost an antonym to self-governance. Mm-hmm. And the more we understand that and grab onto that as sort of a measure of success that is sort of undermining that, I think the better off we will be.
Yeah, that's good. Greek word techne means art. Arche means rule or governing principle. So makers of things rule us now. Sophisticated makers of things. They get to decide how to raise your kids, how to whatever. And
they're well credentialed, as the currency of the realm goes.
Different ways. We're both in the education business, and Hillsdale College is very sophisticated. We've a bunch of PhDs, and we got a bunch of charter schools, and it really ticks off regulators when I point out that K through 12 education is not rocket science. In fact, no education is rocket science until you get to rocket science. But before there, you've got to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic, and natural science and human science. And that's basic. And it can't be true that parents are by nature incompetent to teach those things. Otherwise, the family would never have made any sense. And that's, do you homeschool? I think you do.
We're in year 11 of homeschooling, so Mrs. Roberts deserves almost all the credit for that. And best as we can tell, it's been successful because our standard for success in homeschooling, Larry, is very simple. Don't mess them up.
Yeah. They want to know. Okay, that's where we are. Now you work at the Heritage Foundation, and it's the biggest think tank, I think, biggest conservative one, for sure. And you want to help us get out of this mess. How are you going to do that? What does that world look like?
Well, first we have to understand it took many decades to get into this mess. And so we have to have the fortitude as conservatives to know that while a sense of urgency is good, we're going to have that sense of urgency for decades. Mm-hmm. And so what we do at Heritage is work backwards from a given year. Now, I think this is going to take 50 to 75 years to correct. But that doesn't mean I don't want anyone to misunderstand what I'm suggesting when I say that. It doesn't mean that we're passive or somehow slow. It's just it's that big a problem, and so much of this is social and cultural as well. But what we do, as you know, as a trustee, is we pick a year in the future. And in this conversation, I'm going to pick the year 2037 for a reason I'll tell you in a minute. And we work backwards from that year and say, what do we think we can get done tactically, practically? Not just in Washington, but very importantly, and this gives you some insight into our thinking, in state capitals. Because a vital part of taking back America, as it were, which is just a different way of saying revitalizing self-governance, is to diminish the power that exists in Washington, D.C. Why 2037? Everything does not ride and fall with elections, but they sure are important. And the left has shown that. 2037 because a former member of a former Republican president's cabinet mentioned to me when I asked him how many consecutive years in office of the presidency, the U.S. Senate, and the U.S. House will conservatives need in order to be well on the path toward restoring self-governance. And he said 12 years. Mm-hmm. And so I'm assuming that the election goes well for conservatives this year. Whoever succeeds President Trump as the more conservative candidate hopefully gets 2 terms, whoever he or she is, and hopefully they're a conservative policymaker. And 2037 will be the year that he or she is passing the baton to that next president. This next 12 years for us at Heritage is vital just to somewhat broaden the narrow path that we're on. That's just the political side of this. Diminishing power in D.C., taking on the administrative state, as we were talking about in an offline conversation, making Washington, D.C. less top-heavy, more representative of the economy, of society. But to go back to this second stream of social and cultural issues, Americans in their daily lives we have to take more initiative for our own self-governance. And that isn't just Larry as an individual and Kevin as an individual standing up against big government. It's standing up against big agriculture, against big tech. It's saying that we're not going to let social media turn us into slaves of that, big media turning us into slaves of that. America still has that in her. Americans still have that in them. In fact, I think a pretty clear majority of Americans do. But the point is we need to get ahead of steam here, both in the politics and in society and culture. I'm cautiously hopeful that we will do that. And I think it's possible that we can still do this even if the election doesn't go well for conservatives. But we're down to a few elections in order to start reversing course.
Name some big laws that need passing or eliminating or both.
Do I get to possess a magic wand?
Yeah.
Or do I have to be...
I can name a couple of things that would be very important, but tell me your couple or 4. I don't care.
Well, if we can be truly aspirational, and I say the following, not merely as someone who believes in the free market, but far more importantly, in the effect that the tax code has on undermining self-governance, we need to completely overhaul our taxation system in this country for this reason. I mean, I care about the corporate tax rate, but I almost don't care. What I really care about in the tax code is the existing disincentives to family formation. There are disincentives in the tax code to lower income people being married, which we believe, according to our research at Heritage, has an effect on the birth rate. These are existential problems for America as a society. So if I had a magic wand, I would simplify the tax code. The second thing that I would do is I would get Congress to completely overhaul, at the very least, the Department of Education. And, if I had my druthers, if Heritage had its druthers going all the way back to the day the Department of Education was founded, we would eliminate it entirely. Not for the purposes of harming public education, but quite the opposite, for the purposes of helping kids and helping teachers who want to take initiative. And then the third thing that I would do is make sure that Congress passes a balanced budget amendment. Because I think part of the problem in D.C. is that an assortment of factors, including the grotesqueness of K Street lobbyists who lobby against our interests as individual Americans, have created this disincentive structure for even well-intentioned members of Congress to mind their P's and Q's fiscally. And to sum up here, it isn't all, Larry, that everything has to do with money, are with the tax code. It's just that if we're going to change laws, we want to give our members of Congress some parameters in which they must live so that we can, frankly, shrink the size of government. And once we do that, we're focused on the mechanical ways we can shrink the size of government in some key ways, then I think you will see states and therefore localities and people taking more initiative.
That's very good. Excellent list. See, the Department of Education is old, right? The origins of it are 1867.
Which very few people know.
Yeah. The first guy who ran it, by the way, said out loud that we should organize it after the model of Prussia, where every classroom in Prussia at every hour in Germany was doing the same thing. And he thought that was a goal. And people were horrified at that, so they changed the name of the department to Bureau of Education. They downgraded it after a year. And it became a department again, cabinet level. I actually believe that there are 4 proper cabinet departments in America, and they're in the original Constitution. And there are 4 things that the federal government must do, and only it does. And the other ones are things that are mostly state-level things or private sector things. So I would go as far as the most radical proposal ever proposed from the Heritage Foundation. That's a long way. Anyway, but just take it as a model. What we get the idea of, it's in, like if you listen to the news, which is dreadful activity, the word unregulated is a synonym for illegitimate, whereas nothing is actually unregulated. If you don't have these high-stakes testing, how can parents know if their children are learning? You know, by and large, parents tend to live with the children. And do you think it's hard to tell if a kid can read? I mean, it's easy. And remember, if you do these tests, there's an enormous bureaucracy that's going to write these tests. And that's going to drive curricula. And then the reply came to me, not from the actual president himself, but one of his senior people. I did talk to him about this a couple times. He said, you can write the test. And I said, that's naive, because I'm not respectable. All I am is a college president and a recalcitrant college. Whereas this is an industry, right? And they're going to write it. And they're going to decide. Whereas it's a national scandal, true, right now, that the national goal in America is that every kid learn to read by the end of the 3rd grade. And that's shameful, because kids read by nature. Anyway, that's very angry-making to me. But see, and that gets me to my general last point, not just education. Come to find out, accountability is in the people. It's in the individual people. It's in parents over children. It's in neighbors over neighbors. It's among employees and employers. It's customers and businesses. In other words, the American society is rife with accountability. And this is this thing that's, like I have 1,650 students. Hard to get in here. I have about 3,500 competitors. If you can get in here, you can get in nearly anywhere. They can leave if they want to. I get all of my authority from them. They give it to me, you see. And my employees, there's a bunch of them here, overhead.
All named Josh.
Yeah, they're all named Josh. And, I try to get good ones. I got Josh. No, they can all go somewhere else if they want to. And they can get a job. This is a good place to work. People get a good reputation, right? In other words, why do I need the authority of somebody who never comes here and doesn't even do this for a living, telling us how to do it? Whereas we lose sleep at night over the levels of account. And see, if we could restore the natural sovereignty of that opinion, you see, it's not, you have to have some outside way to bless it, because that outside way will not have the same interest of the people who are actually participating.
It's such a core point, and as no doubt members of your audience are probably already thinking about, take this great example you're mentioning of Hillsdale College, and think about how unexpectedly 3 or 4 years ago, because of the overwrought COVID lockdowns, individual parents who had no earthly idea what was going on during the daytime at school, they would see the outcome of it, right? At home, to your point. They got a bird's eye view and they didn't like it. And when they started asking questions, what happened? They didn't like the answers, because the answers were all born out of this top-heavy system that is probably 100 years past due for reform. But the second thing is, some of them were called troublemakers and domestic terrorists. Why? Because they were being angry or violent? No. They were simply asking questions of a regime that does not like questions being asked of it, because there really isn't a persuasive case to be made for the power that they have. All of this to say, as much as someone might be discouraged by the scope of the problems we have, the American people are still on our side. They just have to be given the transparency and the insight into these problems, and also to understand the role that they can play, even if it's just in their families and communities, in helping to restore order.
So this is a change in thinking that we're describing. And earlier we talked about politics and culture and how they're related. You can see that the way many think today, in our view, is unnatural. The natural thing is, this is my kid. I'm supposed to take care of it. And the unnatural thing is, I've got to ask somebody I don't know, and they've got to tell me how to do it. And that's, if the world, by the way, were appointed that way, the family would not make any sense whatsoever. Well, isn't one of the favorite things, I have 4 children and 2 grandchildren. You have 4 children and not yet grandchildren. You're younger than I am. You look forward to that. My grandchildren are better than yours will be, I can tell you.
Just have to ask you.
Yeah, it's,
Challenge accepted.
That's it. But the point is, my wife and my daughter both thought, wow, how do I do this? Having a kid, that's a big deal, right? And the thing is, they discovered that they knew how, and they can figure it out. And that's so the sovereignty. Now, that's been disrupted by laws, and the laws, if you know the history of the country and the history of the growth of the bureaucratic form, which, remember those big numbers I mentioned, right? That is a change in the nature of the nation. That to move all that money and all those resources and all that authority from local to a distant place, that's as big a thing as the receding of the Roman Empire. It's as big a thing as moving across the frontier. It's as big a thing as establishment of the country. So there you go. Now, some laws that could change, that would begin the process, because that's what takes 50 years, right? We have to start living step by step a different way and restore the attitudes that go with that way. Now, what are some big laws? You name some, but like in education, it's easy because that's what I do. Just take the idea that the sovereign entity is the school. The school can be in a home, but wherever teachers and parents and children are gathered, that's where the sovereignty should lie, and that's where the accountability would be. And then anybody can start a school, which is a big prospering movement in America today.
Schools of all stripes, right?
Yeah, and so what would you do in healthcare? How would you?
Well, there's a strong corollary between education and healthcare, both structurally in the problem and therefore structurally in the solution. And that is to say, in both cases, in the cases of both industries, we have artificially inserted a third party. In the case of education, the government. And in the case of healthcare, the government. Not that government doesn't have a role per se. It just shouldn't have the role that it does on the scale that it does. So in healthcare, what we're fond of at Heritage, because we're aspirational, is that we can tackle healthcare and, say, Social Security, at least partially, that problem of funding it beyond 10 years with the same law. And that is to create a lifetime savings account, lifetime freedom account. This is based on the concept of a health savings account, which has been very successful, but it's successful only for those Americans who can afford a high deductible health plan. I won't get into the weeds of that, but just to say that let's just posit for a moment that we care about the marriage rate in this country. We care about the birth rate in this country. We better, otherwise this country is going to be very different culturally and economically and religiously in no more than 40 or 50 years. It's already well on that path with probably 12 million illegal aliens sitting here as we're recording this. All of that to say, starting at birth, provide tax incentives in the reformed tax code for people who are married, for people who have children and choose that. And that is connected not only to their retirement account toward the last decades of their life, but also to healthy choices in their healthcare. In other words, you're minimizing the role that the third-party government has in this and putting in the hands of Americans the choices they make for physicians, for emergency care, which we should use a lot less in this country, and for specialized care, which frankly, we should use a lot less in this country. It's one of the reasons it's expensive. Where we have seen pilot programs for this kind of thing in a handful of states, to go back to the importance of federalism here, we have seen a dramatic reduction in healthcare costs without a dramatic reduction in healthcare outcomes. So in other words, Larry, what we plead for at Heritage is an aspirational vision. I don't like using the word holistic, especially in public policy, but in this case, it's right. A holistic vision of public policy in which the government is serving the people and serving self-governance by giving them choices, some parameters on that, of course, especially given that this will be a sort of philosophical transition, a transition in thinking. But I actually think we're on the cusp of a conservative healthcare revolution. I don't agree with RFK on much, but I respect him. I agree with him entirely about his indictment of this system, his indictment of the healthcare system, his indictment of big agriculture. I'm very fond of someone who's now a friend, Callie Means. We hope to be doing more work on healthcare with him at Heritage, where they have, in a short span of time, with the imprimatur of Donald Trump, said, we're going to make America healthy again. That, for me and for us at Heritage, isn't a political slogan. We can't be interested in those. It actually is sort of an aspirational vision or something that can become that in the next years. It's incumbent on us who suggest to policymakers a way forward that we get out of the thinking that we've been in for 30 or 40 years, which has been well-intentioned and right for those circumstances, and realize we've got an opportunity in front of us over this next 12 years to reset the table on education policy, on healthcare policy, on Social Security policy. I understand that President Trump is fearful of talking about that, and I get the politics of it. But the reality is, in my lifetime and career as a public policy person, we're going to have to deal with it. And we need to deal with it in a way that keeps people whole, that honors our promise. Very important in this republic to do that, but also provides an even better promise for younger people who are paying into Social Security so that they can live really nice retirements.
See, aspiration. Okay, let's talk about defending the country. How are we doing on that front? What would you change?
F minus.
F minus.
Yeah, it starts with a strategic vision by the President of the United States, and to some extent, leaders of both parties of the House and the Senate. And there was a time, you remember these times well, and even though I'm a little younger than you are, I remember them well, when both parties, leaders of both parties, were great defenders of this country, some of them literally serving in uniform. But certainly politically, there might have been little differences at the margin about how much money to spend versus domestic spending. But now on the radical left, thankfully not every Democrat, they can't, because they don't like the idea that is America. I don't think they like the place that is America. Thankfully, not every person on the left. But the problem is on the right, too many people, and I say this respectfully of friends, are stuck in the 1980s. They think that we're still fighting the Cold War against the Soviet Union. And when they see Russia, for example, invading Ukraine, which is unconscionable, that somehow it's the same thing as what we were confronting in Korea and Vietnam. And it isn't, because the real problem for the United States is what's going on domestically. We are weaker as a republic by every measure that I can think of as I sit here than we were in the 1980s. We need to get that house in order while also recognizing that our military, for example, has to prioritize defending the United States through the lens of what makes sense for Americans, not people of other countries, before it starts implementing what some of these armed forces branches call their first priority, which is implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion. Mm-hmm. And then finally, we have to recognize that as troublesome as Russia is, and as troublesome as Iran is, that our greatest adversary, I think, in the history of this republic is the Chinese Communist Party. And our military is not yet prepared for the potential war with them. This is a cauldron of problems and competing aims that the next president of the United States is going to be confronted with.
And so what do we do? Defense build up?
No. Start with a defense audit. I would estimate that at least a third of the Department of Defense's budget is spent on weapons programs that exist because they're good politics and they're not good defense. At Heritage, we would be supportive of a modest increase in defense spending if what happened first was an audit of existing outdated programs.
I see. And you're saying there might be a bureaucratic problem there.
Well, to quote our mutual friend, Newt Gingrich, who's been saying this since he was a backbencher, the Pentagon ought to be a triangle. When I say that, friends in the Pentagon say, oh, man, you're against defense. No, that's not what we're saying. We're saying let's take an audit, basically an efficiency audit, and let's make sure that what we're spending on are the right things so that we can spend whatever we need to spend on what are the right things. But they oppose that because this might be a surprise. Even defense programs are politicized in Washington.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I noticed that the Israelis have been clearing tunnels in a hostile urban environment at much lower cost than we did in Iraq, where we fought well. And I noticed they're not made out of money, as we seem to be, because as long as you can borrow the future, you can have a limitless supply for a time. Anyway, Edward, the great Ed Lutwak, an old line, very talented foreign policy analyst, he writes that their armored personnel carriers are better than ours because you don't have to get out to fight in those. There are cameras embedded all over the armor of those things, many redundant cameras, and there are big screens inside, and they can fight from inside. And then they have these little cheap drones that they design and make, and they blanket an area, and they can look in every window, and they can see what the threat is. And then when they get to the mouth, they find the tunnel and get to the mouth of the tunnel, then they call people who are specialists in clearing the tunnel, and their casualties are very low. And they're not a very big country, and they can't borrow, their GDP into the indefinite future. Nobody lend it to them. So maybe we should learn from them.
We should. And one of the major factors, I would argue the major factor that's preventing that kind of innovation in the American military, which used to be, thank goodness, the most innovative military force on the planet, is the collusion, and I use that word carefully and without hyperbole, the collusion between our biggest defense companies and our federal government. They both of them, those companies and our government, prevent the small, new, innovative entrants into the defense space from being able to get contracts. And so one of the additional laws that if you gave me a policy magic wand I would pass is to change that, not at the expense or harm of these once noble American defense companies. We need them. We need what they bring to the table, which is scale. But we have to allow these new entrants into the defense industry. Many of them are in Silicon Valley. And if you think about the future of warfare, which our heritage scholars are writing more and more about, especially the potential war in the Far East, it is going to be warfare that you and I don't recognize. And I would like to think that the larger defense companies can get there in their innovation. But the history of business and commerce, as you know well, Larry, is that usually those new ideas come from the smaller places, because even a great profitable company becomes so bureaucratic that by the nature of bureaucracy, it stifles the innovation that would bubble up among its own network. So this is one of the big and underappreciated reforms that needs to happen for the benefit not just of free people worldwide, but particularly for Americans themselves.
That's great. Okay. Well, we're going to close on a high note. There's an argument from Abe Lincoln that the final cause of America is the Declaration of Independence, and the formal cause of America is the Constitution. The goal and the method of operation. Apply what you've recommended. How does it fit with those two things? How does it get us closer to that system of limited and constitutional rule that is responsible for our greatness?
Well, it won't surprise you to know or to hear that not only do I accept, but enthusiastically so, Mr. Lincoln's framing, but I think our recommendations at Heritage fit neatly within that framing. And that also makes sense philosophically and ideologically, as to say who Heritage has been as an institution of civil society for 51 years and who it comes from. Direct ideological, philosophical line from Lincoln. The emphasis on self-governance, the emphasis on which Heritage actually invests in other organizations and institutions outside D.C. in revitalizing associational life, institutional life, communities. Very important to, say, the spirit of the Declaration. But we also tactically, in the laws we propose, in our endorsement, for example, of a couple of good constitutional reforms like the Balanced Budget Amendment, understand that there must be some political and policy reforms attendant to those social and cultural changes. And by the way, I should say, as we're closing, that even though both of those efforts are aspirational, and we will need to muster a lot of perseverance and political will, and even though we're going to have to win a lot of elections, I think we're going to do it. And the reason I do is because it's still America, and that hasn't changed.
Amen. Amen. That's brilliant. You do splendid work. Proud to have you here. You're going to give a chapel lecture after this, and you're an important man. Glad to have you with us.
It's a great team with a great board. Thank you, and Hillsdale.